The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, good evening. Glad you guys could join us for our webinar this evening, The Path to USMLE Success, or first day for the USMLE Step 1, the really short version. I am your speaker and host tonight. My name is Tao Lee. I am an Associate Clinical Professor of Allergy Immunology at the University of Louisville. I am better known to you, most of you, as the editor for the first day for the USMLE series. I'm also the founder and chief education officer for USMLE-Rx and ScholarRx. So welcome tonight. Unfortunately, one of our RX coaches, one of the folks that does tutoring, unfortunately, he's feeling under the weather, so he couldn't join us tonight. We still have Jeff, one of our, one of our leaders who does student outreach here, and he'll be happy to answer questions. And so if you have a question about preparing for the boards, he will do his best. And Louise, who's also one of our ministers, might help out as well too about answering certain questions as they feel comfortable about preparing for the USMLE and finding resources and so forth. If we can't answer your questions, then feel free to connect to us through social media and so forth. We'll show you all the links and so forth at the very end, and we'd be happy to try to continue the conversation that way. So, and again, just FYI, if you're on a laptop or a desktop computer, you should be able to ask questions in the question panel on the right side. If you're on the app, it's going to be, depending on whether it's iOS or Android, it'll be either on the top or bottom. You'll find tabs or buttons that will get you into the Q&A panel to answer questions or ask questions. As a matter of, let's go ahead and get going. So the first word in the book First Aid for the USMLE Step 1 for 33 years, as we go into our 33rd edition here, is relax. As the test has evolved and gone from one form to another, it's always about keeping the long view in mind. So that's what we ask you to do here as well too. In the next 45 minutes to an hour, we're going to cover all these areas. We're going to talk about basics, goals, timelines, approaching the subject, choosing resources, study tips. We will have a raffle at the end, actually. So you stick around in the raffle, you might win one of two 6-month RX 360 packages. That includes our question banks, our first aid videos, our first aid flashcards, and our bricks, our curriculum bricks. It's our latest learning resource that students find really helpful for studying in medical school and actually even preparing for the boards. And then we'll have some Q&A at the very end. So let's get going. So the very first, I do want to see who's out there. So I'm going to ask you to tell us who you are. So I'm going to send out this poll question. You should be receiving it in the next few seconds or so. And you should be able to choose one of 4 options, whether you're an MD student, a DO student, whether you're an international medical graduate or international medical student, and whether you were born in the United States, and you are, whether you're born in the United States or outside the United States. So we'll leave that open for 10, 15 seconds. There's usually a bit of a delay in tabulating the results, so we'll keep it over to make sure we can get as much response as possible. So I am seeing that we have about 2/3 of the responses, so that's fantastic. Let me go ahead and close the poll and share the responses. And what you see is most of the folks that are out there today are international medical graduates. They're come from outside the country. And then we have a fair number of students that are inside the country as well too, going to US schools or going to international schools, but are from the US. In fact, this might be a good test of the question and answer platform. If you just throw into the question platform where you're from, that'd be cool. I'll try to see if I can shout out what country you're from as you put that into the question and answer box in the Q&A panel. And while you're doing that, I am going to ask another question. All right, we got something from Sierra Leone. Find this. The other question I'm going to ask is, when do you plan on taking the exam? Is it soon or sometime next year? So we got folks from all over, by the way. India, Michigan, Detroit. Oh, so 2 different people. One from Michigan and one from Detroit. Funny. The Ukraine. I hope you guys are safe out there. Washington, D.C. We've got Atlanta, Kenya. So that's early in the morning. Guatemala from the south. Haiti, India again. Maryland. We got a good mix out there tonight. Another person from Haiti. All right, looks like most people have answered. Let me close and share the results. As we can see, it's kind of spread out. We got folks that are taking really soon, late in the spring. April, June, that's typically popular particularly for medical students. And then you got a lot of folks who are preparing way ahead. So there's possibly some M1s or some folks who are a little away. So that's fine. We'll hopefully there'll be something for everybody here. And hopefully you'll be able to learn from each other. Okay, great. So a couple of basics about the step 1. It's a 1-day exam, 8 hours total. There's 280 questions in 7 1-hour blocks, so that's 40 questions per block. That works out to 90 seconds per question, and you have 45 minutes of break time. Here's a simple schematic of the USMLE. The 7 blue blocks here represent the seven the question blocks. This is kind of an orientation block, and here's the trick. This orientation block is the same block you use when you download the USMLE software. When you first get oriented. So if you do this ahead of time and only go into this just to set the volume of your headphones and whatnot, you should actually be able to capture most of the 15 minutes that are assigned for that orientation block. So you should be able to start off with close to 1 hour of of break time. So just keep that in mind. In terms of question types, it's all single best answer. So that means, sorry, there's a whole bunch of people that chimed in. My bad, I missed that. Boston, India, Turkey, Florida, Venezuela, Maine, Libya, Jamaica. So really diverse crowd tonight. Welcome. Sorry, I missed all that. Welcome to you all. So anyway, single best answer item. You will have a couple of questions that are multimedia. So heart sounds or lung sounds, or you might see a gait disorder, but it's very, very few of that. Clinical vignettes make most of the exam, greater than 85%, probably greater than 90% of the exam. And the majority, I wouldn't say all, but the majority of the questions have what we call multi-step reasoning. What it simply means is that they are integrating multiple concepts or steps that you have to solve or reason through to be able to solve the overall question. So an example of that is this clinical case here, which is a 32-year-old woman presents with a 5-day history of occasional double vision and bilateral ptosis. And the question is, what is the most appropriate diagnostic test? You can tell from the question that it's not going to be at least a one-step question, right? Because normally, if you're given a clinical case, the first thing you're going to try to figure out is what's going on here, right? So what's the diagnosis? But here is asking what the most appropriate diagnostic test. So to solve this question, you have to come up with a hypothesis or what you think is going on. In this situation here, you got a younger woman with these bilateral findings of laggy eyelids. It's mostly going to be it's likely going to be something like myasthenia gravis. Now you can argue for multiple sclerosis, but they tend to have more unilateral findings. And then so if you think it is myasthenia gravis, then what is the most appropriate diagnostic test, right? I mean, I could boil it down that way. And in this case, it would be acetylcholinesterase antibody, anti-acetylcholinesterase antibody assay. That's the state-of-the-art test. Several years ago, classically, it would have been done with idrophonium challenge, which is known as tensilon or the tensilon test, as a short-acting anti-cholinesterase drug. So that's an example of the two-step questions. You may get some three-step questions. You may get some problem-solving questions where you're given data and you have to run some simple calculations and solve for things like sensitivity, specificity. So it is more about application of knowledge as opposed to regurgitating or facts and recall. All right, so let's look at the interface here. And what you're going to see here is that it's a pretty straightforward interface. You've got your stem here, you've got your lead in here. What is the question? And then you've got your answer choices. And it's typically going to be 5. Sometimes it'll be 4, and sometimes it's 6, but 5 is going to be the most common, and maybe occasionally 7, rarely 7 or more. And you're going to get, about 15% of the time, you're going to get some sort of clinical image, or graphic or data or whatever that you need to use for interpretation. Got navigation at the top, you got your timer at the bottom, you got navigation on the side. So that is the typical interface. And one thing I should mention, sorry, you can lock the exam, but that's to go use the bathroom, for example, but the timer will keep going. The other thing to know is that you can change any of your answers here, skip around, change any of your answers, but as soon as you exit the block, you can't go back and change it. The other thing is that if there's any time left over in your block, that goes into your, all right. Now let's talk about scoring and pass rates. Now, obviously we all know it's pass-fail. Now, even though, it is pass-fail, the threshold, at least if you look at the old scale, is at 196 on a 3-digit scale. It went up a couple of points, and the mean had, before they stopped reporting, it had been around 2 and 31 with a standard deviation of 20 points. Now, there's been a lot of controversy about, how this impacts it, and obviously it's been complicated by COVID, the entire pandemic, and all that type of stuff. But we have seen in the last year or two a notable drop in the pass rate. Now this is 2020 to 2021, and remember, some of this didn't, start till the very beginning of the year. So, in the middle of the pandemic, what you were seeing is that you're seeing a little bit of a drop for, in the pass rate for first-time test taker, whether you're allopathic, whether you're osteopathic, it's a smaller drop. You do see a bit of a bigger drop with, international medical graduates. So everybody saw some drop, and with the, and it's hard to kind of, decipher it out with USMLE, pass fail, and the changes in the scores and whatnot. And COVID, all of these things can be somewhat interacting. With regards to USMLE percentiles, this is to kind of show you, again, they don't report the score do the score reports anymore, but you can see it's kind of an S curve where it flattens out at around 270, 275, and before it went pass fail, with the minimum score being 194, now 196, that's where the cutoff would have been. And then, at 50th percentile right here, it would put you, right around 230. Now, USMLE pass-fail step 1 no longer is going to be used as a screening tool. That's going to be moved more to step 2 CK, but it is worth keeping in mind the specialties that tend to use USMLE as a screening tool, and it's all in this mnemonic road to riches. So here you go: radiology, radiation oncology, the surgical subspecialty, aesthetics, plastics, and dermatology. So particularly for IMGs, you're going to need to keep this in mind. I think it applies for everyone. But particularly for IMGs, as oops, I don't know what happened. You need to be able to kind of separate and show your be able to distinguish yourself from other candidates as you go through the match. So in terms of choosing study strategies, a couple of things. You already know, you already know your own learning preferences and study preferences. All of you have, passed rigorous and standardized exams, whether you're from the U.S. or international. But that being said, once you get here, you need to understand, what you're studying and how you can use that to your advantage for studying. And we'll talk about some of the crammable subjects because of their repetitive structure. You need to understand your curriculum in terms of what's high yield or low yield in your curriculum, and then you need to be able to allocate time based on what gets tested on the exam, and where your strengths and weaknesses are. So in the next 10 minutes or so, I'm going to kind of go through the disciplines, at a very, very high level. I'm not going to read through all this. All this stuff is available on our website at firstaidteam.com under resources, and I'll show you where that is, at the very end. I'll kind of hit the highlights, as we go along, and you're going to see some themes, jump out at you. The first theme is, while the step 1, is called a basic science exam, it's really a clinical science exam. It does test you on mechanism of disease. That's where the application comes. But it's almost always doing it in some sort of clinical context. So a patient presents with a condition, or a patient has an injury, a patient is undergoing a procedure. So how do you apply how do you apply your anatomy knowledge to helping understand all that, and or solving for the patient's condition, or explaining, and of course explaining what's going on. Here, neuro and embryo is going to be relatively high yield because it's it lends itself well to clinical vignettes, and it's a pretty well contained set of concepts. You will see structures and so forth, but it won't be cadaveric. It'll be things like X-rays and CTs. You may see some gross path, but again, it's in a clinical context. All right. Biochemistry is one of those crammable subjects. Remember what I mentioned earlier about understanding the structure of content. It's crammable because, particularly in metabolic pathways, there's a recurring set of concepts that you need to know. You need to know the substrate. You need to know how it ends up. You need to know the enzymes involved. You need to know what regulates those enzymes. So you're going to be, for every pathway, you're going to be learning those things, and they kind of work in very similar ways. So in that way, it makes it crammable. Now you will see things that are, again, clinically very relevant, such as vitamin deficiencies, disorders with genetic errors or congenital. So this may be particularly seen in rare congenital conditions in children or newborns. You want to understand the pathobiochemistry, so how biochemistry, impacts pathology. And that's the second thing you're going to see over and over again, which is you're going to be integrating various disciplines. So using biochemistry to understand the molecular pathology, of a specific condition. So be able to integrate that. From a science discovery perspective, you need to know how these laboratory techniques such as PCR, flow cytometry, gas chromatography, things, Western blots and whatnot, how they are used in synthesizing new scientific knowledge, and also how they're used in medicine, right? Because a lot of these techniques are also used every day in laboratory medicine, right? To make diagnoses or to help manage the treatment of patients. All right, microbiology is also crammable. Again, it's crammable because things like distinguished characteristics, target organs, method of spread, and diagnosis, they tend to be repeating concepts when you look at bugs, whether they're bacteria or viruses, right? And that's another thing, is that we tend to equate micro with bacteriology, but don't forget about all this other stuff. With the pandemic, understanding the immune response, understanding how vaccines work is now really paramount. Immunodeficiencies also tend to be high yield because they give you a window into how the immune system works, and it's often due to a gene defect or something like that that can easily explain, or what part of the immune system is being impacted. All right, pathology is a big important topic. You can't skip it. You can't, even if you just want to barely pass the exam, you still have to spend a lot of time in pathology. So you want to know the hallmarks of each of these clinical conditions, how they present, and who they present in. So you may see clues in that. But remember, there's a wide variety of ways that conditions and how they present. So there's not that many pathognomonic presentation situations, particularly when it comes to the actual patient itself. So don't get fooled, because when we tend to think of sarcoidosis as typically in younger Black women, but it can absolutely occur in white women. It can also absolutely occur in white men. So don't, if you're given that information, obviously process it, but if the rest of the clinical condition fits, don't think of this as looking for a pathognomonic situation. We have buzzwords, we have trigger words in first aid, and other how you resources that you study, but make sure you know how these things are clinically described, because that's how it's going to show up on the USMLE. And obviously, once you do a ton of Q-Bank questions, you'll get a hang of those various clinical descriptions of physical findings or symptoms and whatnot. We mentioned earlier that obviously you're going to see images and so forth. Key thing about these images and whatnot is that a lot of time they can be answered without looking at these images. The cases can be solved. I wouldn't say all the time, but I would say greater than 50% of the time when we talk to our, when we discuss it with our first aid authors. And one thing you can do is, make sure when you, read through the question, and you need to have a good question dissection method. And by the way, if you don't have a good question dissection method, you should join our question lab, which runs every month. And I think Jeff can drop a link about that in the chat, and learn how to dissect questions with us. But once you do it, one of the last things you would be looking at would be the image itself, because you don't want to do it without context. All right, pharmacology is crammable. You tend to what gets to repeatedly is mechanism of disease and toxicities. Note that they don't ask for a clinical name, so they're not going to say, hey, what drugs are used? What's the best drug for condition X? That's mostly been moved to step 2CK. Now, they may ask what types of classes may be used. So that's a fair question. but they're not going to ask you about specific drug. You do want to focus most on the prototypic drugs and the major variations. You don't really need to focus too much on the obscure derivatives. You don't need to know anything about trade names or dosages unless you want to use it as part of a kind of a mnemonic memory palace system that you have. Here are the major categories, so I won't read that out. Again, it'll be in the handout that you can get off our website. And again, remember to integrate. So think about how the pharmacology concepts are tied to the biochem, the physiology, and the microbiology, and other systems and disciplines. Physiology is a little different than some of the others. It's concept oriented. Sometimes takes a little bit more effort. Diagrams work well because you're thinking through the relationships, pathways, so forth. And so it's not something you can mass cram. You're often see physiology tied to pathology. So again, integrate, and you're going to see it clinically presented again. And again, remember, it's often about application of concepts, not memorizing or stating the Fick principle or whatever. You have to apply it in a simple clinical scenario. Psychiatry is, in first aid is a mix of psychology, sociology, psychopharmacology. People tend to focus on things like mood disorders and whatnot, but remember there are other high yield areas, and you see them listed here, and those are all covered in first aid. So we think we do generally a decent job of covering the waterfront, at least at a high level. Public health. So you're going to see some of the traditional stuff like biostats, epi, ethics. Some of the new stuff that's been emerging over the last several years include healthcare delivery, patient safety, quality improvement. That's often called health system science. And you also see a lot of health patient communication scenarios there as well too. So keep that in mind. So that was a quick walkthrough, and again, all that is in our handout on our blog. So that's where you can go to get a copy of this talk. And now we're going to talk about review resources. So there's all kinds of stuff out there. There's text reviews like First Aid, QBanks like USMLE-Rx, UWorld, stuff like that. Videos, digital flashcards, physical flashcards, review courses. There's all kinds of resources out there. So how do you pick and choose? Because you don't have all the time in the world, and you certainly don't have all the money in the world. We are acutely aware, and when I was a medical student, my wife was a medical student. We had our fair share of debt. So number one, check out the resource reviews in First Aid for the USMLE Step 1, Section 4. Even if you don't have the latest edition, go to our blog at firstaidteam.com and check it out. We provide this free as a community service. Once you check it out and once you talk to your classmates, you might want to use those resources, get a hold of those resources and use them early, whether it's a QBank or a book or whatever. And also try not to overbuy. It's so easy to overwhelm yourself. There's so many resources out there, and it's easy to get lost in all this stuff. And also, you're going to hear a lot of things from your classmates. This worked, that worked for me, this worked for me. And there's going to be a lot of, I hate to say herd mentality, but at the end of the day, you've got to make your own choice. And so read the reviews, try out some stuff. Don't blindly buy a whole series or a whole platform just because it was great in micro. It might not be great in other areas. So certain things are good for certain subjects and by certain, by certain providers and so forth and authors. All right. So hopefully I have not put you guys to sleep. I'm going to ask another question, and I want to find out what you guys have to think. I want to know, of these resources, could be none of the above or all of the above, what do you think you'll be using or are you using to prepare for the USMLE Step 1? So it could be all of the above, none of the above, 2 or 3, whatever. Let's answer this, and I think this is great data to share with all your colleagues here, so we can share that out. I'm going to leave it open for a bit. Oh, why is my all right? My poll is. I'll give my poll like a couple more seconds. All right, I think most of you guys have voted. I'm going to go ahead and close this. I'm going to share this. So as you can see, no surprise, clearly everybody does QBanks. Videos are very popular, review books are very popular, and then you also see flashcards and mobile apps being used, out there. So no right or wrong answer. This just happens to be what's popular. The other thing that's worthwhile, we don't ask about this, but definitely use your syllabi materials, your lecture materials, or whatever you use during medical school. You're already familiar with it, so it's much easier to start from something you already know. But remember that a lot of this stuff may be low yield for the exam. All right, I'm going to stop sharing that poll so we can get back to the presentation. Now let's talk about study tips. So there's a couple of things to think about. One is developing a good study schedule. I think I saw Jeff, earlier on, dropping a link about the free study planner. So get a good system and use it. There's stuff out there you can buy. There's also our study planner, which is completely free, and it integrates with first aid. Use that to plan out. And if you do it well, I'm going to skip around a little bit. If you do well and you make sure you schedule time to be a human, make sure you schedule time for breaks, exercise, personal issues, and I do strongly recommend doing one, even if you're in dedicated period, doing 1 day a week where you're not doing any stuff, maybe a couple questions or whatever, but nothing, but otherwise just getting relaxed. Then you can kind of, then that's all part of, keeping the long view, as well too. The other thing is you can, as I mentioned, those crammable subjects like micro or, pharmacology, you can save those towards the end because, while we obviously do not want to cram, that's not a great learning technique at all. When you're like a week or two away from the exam, it's possible to start cramming some stuff. And it not be too bad because you just need to get through that exam day, 1 or 2 weeks later. Mentioned earlier about integrating and applying everything. Remember, this is all about application. You have to think like a clinician, and you have to integrate and you have to synthesize across all these disciplines and organ systems. You heard me say earlier that's better to relearn stuff that was high yield that you already knew. So definitely do that. And lastly, for organization's sake, as I mentioned, we do have a checklist in the front of the book. It's right after all the acknowledgments and so forth, but before section 1. So you can use that to kind of keep you on track and organized. All right. So so that's a little bit of advice there. And again, if you have questions, feel free to, again, about studying, feel free to drop it into the question box. Jeff will try to answer as many questions as he can, and then I'll ask Jeff to kind of flag some of the more common thematic questions. We'll cover them at the very end. All right. So computer-based testing tips, CBT. So a couple of things. Just be familiar with the CBT tutorial, use that ahead of time so you get your free 15 minutes back. There are some keyboard shortcuts. Most people don't use it, but it's good to know that they're there. And clearly, computer-based testing, it's all about using questions throughout. And there's a lot of good science behind this. There were studies published in the journal Science and publicized in the New York Times where they showed that if you learn through questions, this is called retrieval practice, you can do better than other methods of studying, including studying once, repeatedly cramming, and concept mapping. You can do better than all those study techniques, and it still is superior even with complex inferential questions. All right, let's talk about computerized online or digital practice options. Well, obviously there's stuff from the USMLE itself, They just updated their sample tests not too long ago, earlier this year. It's helpful for format familiarity. I think they're doing it a little better in terms of making it a little more authentic. Sometimes they were giving really easy items, so I would not strongly recommend it as a authentic experience, but like I said, good for format familiarity. Now, next is the NBME CBSSA. National Board of Medical Examiners is the same folks who create the USMLE. CBSSA stands for the Comprehensive Basic Science Self-Assessment. They have 4 to 6, 6 to 7 forums out there. They're about 50, 60 bucks a piece. They're about 250, 60, 240 questions. I'm sorry, 200 questions where you have several blocks of questions that you can go through, and it's helpful for benchmarking. Some of the newer forums now have answers, and some of them have explanations to them, moving in that general direction. It's good for benchmarking, and they will give you a prediction probability of passing the exam. QBanks, of course, will do the same thing. USMLE is one of those. UWorld, AMBOSS, there's plenty out there, and they're good for practice studying and for simulation, and they also can help predict your outcomes on the USMLE. All right, now we're going to talk about what the research shows out there, right, and what is considered to be effective. So not surprisingly, QBanks are more effective whether you're using USMLE-Rx or UWorld or whatever. They tend to be more effective than flashcards. Why? Because QBanks, the questions in QBanks are structured just like step 1, whereas flashcards are not, right? Anki flashcards and stuff like that, they're good for, helping you memorize, but they're not good for synthesis and application, right? So that's where you need to do it on QBanks. The next question is, well, how many QBanks questions do you need to do that? In fact, I just think I saw somebody ask that very same question. So on average, you need to be anywhere between 300 to 400 questions to increase 1 point of outcome from where you currently are. Now that's adjusting for a GPA and MCAT. Now, obviously, some of you folks came from the outside of the United States, but for wherever you are, this takes into account, your entrance exam to medical school and your grades. Now, in the study out of University of Michigan that was published several years ago, students that did more than 3,200 questions, so essentially more than 3,000 questions, did the best. And in fact, you want to make sure that they are unique questions. So in other words, it's 3,200 non-repeated questions. So simply doing one question bank 3 times, I don't care if it's UWorld or whatever, or even our question bank, you can repeat it if you want it for the purpose of learning, but for the purpose of the testing effect, you want to do unique multiple questions. There is this phenomenon called fluency that occurs in cognitive psychology. Basically, if you do stuff over, you feel better because, wow, I got it, But the reason why you got it is because other things make you more familiarized with it, so it's called fluency, as opposed to you actually learning it. And there is a term called desirable difficulty. So it may not feel great to do questions you've never seen before, but that's how you learn. That's kind of like how you build your muscles. Same thing about when you go out and work out, right? No pain, no gain. No difficulty learning, no actual learning. If it feels too easy, then you're actually not learning. The last thing is about first aid. So again, the study out of the University of Michigan, they looked at students' use of first aid, and those that did 3 passes or more did better on their step 1 than those that did not. But if you do first aid, it should not be about just highlighting first aid and memorizing it. So again, that's been shown not to be helpful. You have to create active learning out of it. So so that's why we have the first aid flash facts, first aid flashcards in USMLE-Rx. And so if you do those flashcards, that will guarantee you to get you through first aid multiple times in an active learning way, to support your probability of passing the USMLE Step 1. All right. Next is test day itself. It's something that most of us just want to do once, right? So you often don't have many days like this. Knock on wood, thankfully. So you want to make sure you're not overdoing coffee or caffeine that day. You want to have layered clothing. You often will go into a test environment that's office environment that can be really cool, really cold. So be careful that it can be cold or even warm. So dress accordingly. I mentioned earlier that you need to go in with an established question dissection method, and we have a 7-step method that we teach in the question lab. And again, Jeff dropped that link for any of our question labs in a little while ago. And one of the steps is reading the lead-in as one of the very first steps that you do. It allows you to quickly understand how many steps you're dealing with. If it's a diagnosis lead-in, for example, then it's going to be a 1-step question. If it's a treatment or it's like a class treatment question, then it often may be a 2 steps. What's the diagnosis? And then what class of drugs treat this particular condition, right? So it helps you set up your question dissection strategy once you go back through the STEM or the clinical case. With regards to managing the clock, you have, again, 90 seconds per item. Some of the majority of the items can be done, but occasionally you will get some really big chunky items. It's unpredictable that way because there's many versions of the exam. And so, what we recommend is that, when you try to dissect and break down a question and get to the answer, try to come up with at least a preliminary answer within 70 to 75 seconds and go ahead and mark it down, on your screen. Now, you can go ahead and then, after you answer, you can check it to, like mark it for later review if you want to. But remember, try not to do more than 8 or 10 or whatever, because if you do that, you commit and you do put a preliminary answer for each question. When you get to the end, you're gonna have good 8 to 10 minutes to go back and work on that. But remember, each question may take you another minute and a half to work through if you want to see if you can solve that. Now, there is a corollary about second guessing. You might have heard people tell you, oh, never second guess. You'll always zig when you should zag, but that's not necessarily true. The data actually shows that on average, we do better when we second guess ourselves. But you need to do it in a very deliberate and intentional way. You can't just be doing it in a panicked way. So you got to have a system. Make sure you give yourself another 60 to 90 seconds. Make sure it's because, well, I need to try to figure out, is it between A or B or that type of stuff. If you haven't been able to rule out anything, then you might as well exercise what we joke as the C reflex, which is just choose the letter C and move on, because you're better off just saving that time than agonizing over a question that you can't possibly solve because you never were exposed to it or whatever. And you should just hope that it's an experimental question or a question that's placed in there as kind of a diagnostic question to ensure the psychometric quality of the entire exam.